Welcome back, everyone. Michael here with Offshore Citizen. Today we're going to talk about my predictions of what will happen in places like communist California, New York, and a bunch of other areas, whether that means you should be investing, where you should be investing, and kind of dive into kind of just what I see as the long-term tapestry in light of a lot of stuff that's going on right now. So before we dive into that, if you haven't subscribed already, please click the subscribe button, click the notification bell, get yourself up to date. And if you're interested in any of these topics about international, offshore, etc., you can book a call with me, clarida.fm/Michael Rosmer, or visit our websites, offshorecitizen.net, offshorecapitalist.com. Let's dive into it. All right, so there is a trend right now. I don't know if you've seen on YouTube and places like this, but if you just kind of start going down the rabbit hole and YouTube's algorithm starts referring it to you, there's a lot of people who are leaving California. Okay, you're seeing quite a bit out of New York as well, but California is getting a lot of press. And I think it's worth it to talk about this subject because it informs kind of the general trajectory of a large part of the world that's getting the attention in California, but I think California is probably in many respects just an early indicator of what you're going to see in a bunch of parts of Europe, etc. Okay, so I want to kind of like paint the picture of how the world has changed over the last 10 years, which I think is highly underestimated. I want to paint the picture for you of what it is going to mean in terms of where you should be investing, what the likely ripple effect over time is, and what I think the consequences will be in terms of the political landscape over the next while. And then, of course, that relates to taxes, investing, etc. Okay? All right, so let's start off with the fact that the world has changed, in my opinion, much more dramatically than almost anyone is really aware of, especially kind of like what I would call the gray hairs, the establishment, these types of people. Like, they just do not understand how much the world has changed in the last 10 years. If you listen to Peter Thiel, he talks about how, in his perspective, basically since 1973, we've had this, drop off of growth, this stagnation, etc. And I like Peter Thiel. I don't necessarily buy into his narrative about that. He says that, hey, listen, the only place that we've seen this advancement really has been in the area of digital in terms of bits, etc. But I think that he fails to account for how significant that effect is across many, many spaces. And the two major areas that I'm going to look at here are education, which is ripe for disruption, and I think we're going to see over the next 10 to 20 years huge disruption in that space, as well as working. Okay, and this is going to have a lot of consequences in terms of things like tax, in terms of cost of living, in terms of what you should be doing, in terms of how governments are going to respond, and so on and so forth. Okay, so what really, if you go back 10 years, think about, I'll go back for myself to 20 years ago, right? 20 years ago, I had a small business in doing computer service and sales, and it was really hard to learn things back then. You were basically exposed to your local market. I was in a small town of 10,000 people. I was one of the experts in the town, so I didn't really have a lot of people that I could learn from. The internet was still in kind of its nascent phase. There definitely wasn't a plethora of options in terms of learning. Certainly the conditioning around things like search. Search wasn't really very good back then. There certainly was no YouTube, things like this. And what that meant was that you were still very localized in terms of your market. Okay? Fast forward 20 years, and in particular the changes over the last 10 years, what have you seen? You've seen smartphones, you've seen video. These things, I think, in particular, there's also messaging and some other collaboration tools, etc. Actually, we're working on building a collaboration tool right now, so stay tuned for that. But what has happened is that people don't realize how good the tools have gotten. So you have a lot of companies, even in places like Silicon Valley, that I feel like they were kind of like the forerunners. They were testing remote work. They're like, oh, it doesn't work very well. But they were testing that, and they haven't retested it. So I remember listening to an interview with the creator of WordPress, who talked about meeting with Mark Andreessen, who's a very, very famous venture capitalist, who is also the founder of Netscape. And the guy was saying, hey, listen, what do you know? Because basically WordPress was run remotely, right? They had distributed teams. And he's like, what do you know that companies like Facebook don't? Because they don't do that. And I think the point is that Facebook and those guys might have looked at that at 2006, 2008, But today, things have changed so much in the last 10 years that suddenly your ability to work remotely is phenomenal. So I deal with clients all over the world. Literally, I think we have clients from 51 countries now in all the major continents, right? And you're like, okay, we do that seamlessly. Like it really doesn't matter. I'm here in Bulgaria today. I could be hopefully going to France here in about a week. We can be in Asia, we can be wherever. Aside from time zones and what time of day I need to operate at, and my sleep schedule is very bizarre, it doesn't really matter that much. And increasingly, there's a large number of jobs that are like this. So yes, of course, there's still some things that are localized, but more and more of the economy is not localized. I remember reading a couple of years ago an article from The Economist which said by the year 2030 there was expected to be 1 billion location independent workers. Well, that has been radically accelerated by Corona, okay? Radically accelerated. And what this means is that increasingly companies have an ability to hire remote. And this is going to have two consequences. One is, if you just think about why people, and I've done some videos on real estate and kind of the changing trends as I see them, but why would people move to places like New York, to places like San Francisco, to places like LA? Well, they were doing it because of the work opportunities largely, right? Yes, there's cultural benefits, but those cultural benefits more spring up from the fact that people are there and from the fact that there's work. And when you no longer have to work there, the cost of living doesn't really make so much sense, right? Suddenly you're saying, hang on, why am I paying $5,000 a month for an apartment when I could go and I could pay $1,500 a month somewhere else? For most people, that's a lot of disposable income that they're saving. They don't have a write-off for that. So this is a significant consequence. Then you have businesses who are saying, hang on, why am I spending money on this expensive office space? Then you start to see access to labor, right? If you go and try and recruit people in Silicon Valley, it's a hyper-competitive labor market, which has driven wages way, way up, right? Well, it just makes a lot more sense. And I was watching, who was it? It might have been Intercom or no, I can't remember the name of the company. But anyway, I was watching some things. And so they help with kind of global payroll systems and automating a lot of dealing with your employees, et cetera. Very cool company. And they were saying, hey, listen, they started hiring in Bangalore partially because of price, but partially because they just didn't have the access to talent in the Silicon Valley area. And so increasingly, as we realize that, hey, we can operate remotely, we can operate from anywhere, why on earth would I choose to operate in these really expensive markets? Okay? So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the nature of the world has changed a lot because of YouTube. It used to be that, how would you learn to do something like video editing? I was talking to my brother. He spent $25,000 or something going to film school. And he was commenting that like a year or two later, all the stuff started to happen that digital SLRs started to come out. They started to be accessible. Now you can have pretty good quality filming equipment for relatively cheap. You started to get YouTube allowed HD on their channel, and they took off the limit of like 10 minutes or whatever it is so people could have long videos. Now you started to see this wave of tutorials. Now, I mean, if you want to learn coding, the best thing to do is to sit at home and to learn to do it from YouTube and from some forums. Like, maybe join some Slack chats or something like that. Like, this is incredible how much you can learn without going to formal education. And that is, over the next 10 to 20 years, going to be incredibly disruptive because the cost basis just doesn't make sense anymore. In addition to the fact that, the administration is just over the top, it's ridiculous, total nonsense. Like the way that these institutions are being run makes no sense. They have, this physical cost. Now, there's certain benefits to having the structure that's associated. So I don't think that we've seen sufficient innovation to replace it because we need validated learning still, and we need structured learning with kind of accountability and things like this, as well as kind of the social aspect. If we can kind of recreate those, then I think we can get a lot of mileage out of digital learning that goes the way to just like decimating many of these educational institutions. Okay, why do I bring up all this stuff? I bring up all this stuff because a lot of what has happened so we're seeing in California, and I'm using California as an example, but I'm going to talk a little bit about Spain and some other places as well, because we're reaching this tipping point. So we're seeing lots of people, in particular, wealthy, successful people leaving, right? I was watching a video with Graham Stephan the other day. He was mentioning that it's going to cost him $400,000 in state taxes this year to be in California. So he's moving to Las Vegas, right? Eliminate that $400,000 a year is a lot of money to be saving. A lot of money to be saving. You can buy a Lambo for that, right? You invest that, and say it doubles over 10 years or something, well, now you're talking about 800,000. Doubles again, you're talking about 1.6 million every single year, right? So this is an incredible cost. And I think, to me, the shock of people leaving California is not that people are leaving California, but that they hadn't left sooner. And the reason I think for that is that they were simply not aware. Well, there was two things going on. One was they simply weren't aware of how the world has changed and how the tools and opportunities, et cetera, are now global. Second of all, California has pushed it too far. They've brought in a bunch of new rules which have, the homelessness problem, the rising crime, et cetera, have made it much worse. But now they're talking about raising more taxes, they're putting more regulations on, they're doing more things. You have this completely dysfunctional, retarded, completely useless government. Like, the fact that Californians are not going and dragging their politicians out of the government buildings and throwing them onto the street at this point in time, to me, speaks volumes to how passive we are and really how ridiculous it is that we would tolerate this nonsense. Like, it is really, really, we have like a deeply concerning world in the lack of people who are standing up. It really makes sense how Nazi Germany could succeed in that environment, right? That being said, so I think that what's happened is basically the straw has broken the camel's back. And so it's not any one of these things, it's that it's got built up, and once it starts to collapse, the floodgates release. And what happens is that as more people move abroad, as more people go to Austin, as more people go to Las Vegas, as more people go to Ohio, as more people go to these different places, those places become more competitive, right? You're seeing a spread out. I was watching an interview with Chamath Palihapitiya, where he was talking about, or they were mentioning how he thinks it's great that a lot of what's been good about Silicon Valley is now going to get pollinated across the country, and I think really across the world a lot more, because of the fact that this central bastion is being broken down, okay? So what does this mean? Well, I think that, first of all, right now, it is really, really bad to be investing in California. I think this is kind of a no-brainer, right? I think a lot of people have been saying this. And by the way, New York is kind of similar. I'll cover New York in a second. But I think that if you kind of look, a lot of people were saying, oh, it's just Corona, it's just short term, especially when it comes to New York, it's going to come back, it's all these sorts of things. There was a famous article that was posted recently where it's like New York is toast and it's not coming back. I'll talk about that in just a second. But I think what you're going to see is that these policies haven't yet imploded, okay? So people are leaving, but you haven't seen the consequences of that where it triggers political change. And I look at this very much like Sweden in the 80s. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Sweden was doing phenomenal. They were a really great, successful economy. And then they went hardcore with their socialism. And they basically decimated themselves. And they had to have like a serious conversation and come back and kind of find some balance. And so, coming out of the 90s into, at present, they're a pretty great place, right? Lots of things, yes, okay, high taxes, high socials, things like this. But they've found a way to make it work so that at least things work well, and there's a lot of innovation that comes out of there. There's a large number of unicorns relative to the population base, things like that. Okay, so yeah, from this standpoint, I think that you're facing California is in the early 80s compared to Sweden, right? So what Sweden was in the early 80s, California is now. And these policies, which are insane, are starting to take their effect, but it's going to take probably 5 to 10 years for you to really see them wash out, and you're going to have to see the pendulum swing back, and you're going to have the backlash. And so during that time, I think that it's a bad idea to be investing in that market. I do think, though, that there are certain underlying factors that long-term are going to work really well for California, okay? Which is mainly to do with geography, okay? If you think about it just geographically, I mean, the weather is great. You have access to the ocean and you have access to the mountains, right? You've got a lot of capability for, culture to be there. I mean, right now there is a lot of culture there, but I think that long-term, as people become more freed up to live wherever they want, California will remain a competitive place. I think, though, that what you're going to see is they're going to basically increasingly force out their best people. It's going to be like an Atlas Shrugged scenario, pretty much, right? The people who run the system, who contribute to it the most, are going to be like, I'm leaving. It's going to implode. It's going to have to go through a stage of basically like self-reflection and realizing that, hey, listen, this is a disaster. This is nonsense, etc. And as a result, you're going to see a new wave of things coming back, right? They'll reform their policies, they'll improve, et cetera, and then people will tend to come back. And I think long term, if you were to take a look out 30, 40 years, assuming we get that far, I think that California is perfectly fine. Okay. Now let's look at New York. So New York, similar sort of idea, right? I think less socialist and draconian, and it's not entirely communist like California is. But I think what you're going to see there is, again, a lot of people are leaving. And this is going to create, I think that you're probably going to see a quicker recovery. So whereas I think California is on a downward trend and is more or less going to be on a downward trend for the next 5 to 10 years. Like, this is my prediction, right? Then they're going to have to come like a self-reflection moment and switch things around. They're probably going to have to go through some sort of a transition phase. They're going to play around with things, and 30 years, 40 years out, they're good. In New York, I think it's quite different, because I think New York, what's happened is you've seen a lot of people leave due to. I think that realistically, New York a year from now is going to be worse than New York a year ago. It's going to basically, you're going to kind of see this continued decline while we have all this problem going on with Corona, right? I think that, okay, I'm not as optimistic about coming out of Corona on the other side by the end of 2021, but let's say that we are. Then, okay, great, things start to come back, and they won't come back full steam. Okay, so my perspective is they were up here, they go down to here, and they're going to come back to here. That's kind of like, and I think that that's going to have some major disadvantages. People will be much more hesitant to move there because of the fact that you're going to have a lot of cultural blows. So New York is great because of food, because of theater, because of museums, because of like all this culture and vibrancy that surrounds New York. But when you drive all these people out, like basically these things are all enabled by the fact that you have such a large population base of people who have money who basically can feed into it. So to give some example, a few years ago for my birthday, I did a Michelin 3-star tour. We visited every Michelin 3-star restaurant in the eastern US, 7 of the 9 being in New York. Okay, well, New York could sustain that because of what New York was. But I think that coming out of this, I haven't looked at which restaurants have gone out of business, et cetera. I'm imagining that some have and some will if they haven't already. But you're going to have less of that recover just because there's less of a population base, less of that vibrancy. And it's going to be it'll come back quicker than California, but it will not come back as high. And then I think that over the long term, New York is going to have less, like if I fast forward out 20, 30 years, my prediction would be that New York has less going for it because of the fact that there isn't really anything compelling about New York aside from that population base. So when you take away a portion of that population base, it's just less compelling. That's just the way that it goes. Now, prices coming down, that's good. That'll kind of rebalance things. It was probably a much needed refresh. Okay, why do I bring all this up, and what does this have to do with kind of our international thing? Like obviously, okay, if you're in California, or any of these types of places, my recommendation is move, right? Go to Texas, go to Nevada, go to somewhere else, right? Just from a pure pragmatic standpoint, I think it's a good financial decision. And I think that it will be a good lifestyle decision over the next little while as well. It's also, a great opportunity the person can take advantage of going and moving to Malaysia or Thailand or, Portugal or Greece or whatever, right? Some of these places, because, hey, listen, this is not so great. But now let's think about what's happening in Europe, because we're seeing something quite similar in Europe. I was talking to a friend from Madrid the other day who actually is originally from Venezuela. He commented out to him, Spain right now feels like Venezuela in 1997 when Chavez came to power. So I think there's going to be a bunch of these places that, again, are going to have this horrible experience of being in trouble. Italy, I think, is going to be in trouble. Greece is, they've been in trouble for a while, but I don't think that they're kind of in this renegotiating it stage. And so I think that a bunch of these places like Spain are going to be concerning places to be. We saw recently, of course, John McAfee got arrested for tax evasion in Spain. Shakira is having a thing in Spain. There's like a bunch of different celebrities. They're being pretty aggressive about who they're going after. I think that what you're going to see is that a lot of these places need to kind of rethink how they're doing things for the modern world. And you don't want to be tied into those places very strongly right now. You want to be going where the future is, in my opinion, right? And you want to be taking advantage of the opportunities. Like what this is doing is although it's creating a series of challenges, and there's going to be a lot of kind of like global renegotiation of how things are operating, it's also for the people who are smart about it and who can take advantage, who are willing to go somewhere else, who are able to run their business from anywhere. If you're not able to run your business from anywhere, figure out how to make it run from anywhere. Who are able to take advantage of employing people around the world, who are able to go and take advantage of international structuring, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's a phenomenal time to be doing that. You can be benefiting a tremendous amount. And I think that what this is going to mean is, okay, we can already see in the housing market in the US how some markets are way up and places like New York are down, right? So we're seeing this flow. Now, as people go to different markets, what is that doing? Well, that's boosting those markets up. So we've seen already places like Portugal, right, go up. I think Portugal is still a very compelling place to go and get established. And I think Portugal has some longevity to it for sure in terms of the opportunities. Now, there's some downsides to owning property there and things like this, but the bottom line is it's a pretty good opportunity place right now. I think that places in Eastern Europe are increasingly competitive. I'm hearing a lot of people who are interested in going to Ukraine, right? Ukraine has become a more and more attractive place to go. Obviously, we've had people going to Georgia. Georgia's made it a little bit more difficult, but I think Eastern Europe is a big winner. I think Portugal is a big winner. I think various parts of Southeast Asia are big winners in all of this. And so I'd say those are places that it pays attention to look at, hey, are there investment opportunities? Are there ways that I could relocate there? Are there things that I could take advantage of in terms of employing people there? Obviously, there's some conflict going on between Armenia and Azerbaijan right now, but Armenia, I think, is an interesting place to employ people. So yeah, you've got like this, and then you've got Central Europe kind of emerging out of that as well. I was looking at Kazakhstan fairly seriously recently. I think in a bunch of ways it's not really ready yet, but it's one of these examples of places that are getting there. Now, not necessarily to buy real estate, like I wouldn't buy real estate in Astana, for example, but kind of paying attention to what's going on. You could look at, again, I guess the Middle East as well, like in particular UAE, right? But Qatar also obviously is rising. Bahrain, I don't see rising as much. But anyway, yeah, these are all places that I think they are more the future. We're going to see more and more people going there. I think that as people can relocate where they want, more and more people will choose to go where the weather is good. I think that's going to have a profound impact. People are going to be able to go where their costs are lower, where their quality of life is better, et cetera, and that's going to mean some of these other places as opposed to the places that were traditionally big. And it's going to open up the possibility that whereas before, say you couldn't raise capital for a company that was in Portugal because they wanted you to be in Silicon Valley, I think they're going to become much more flexible as they're seeking places to invest. And so for startups, for companies that are looking at that kind of environment, it's going to be a good opportunity. Anyway, that's my opinion. Would love to hear what you think. Put your comments below. Tell me if I'm, totally off base, if there's things that I'm missing that, I should be seeing here. If you're interested in assistance with any of this, citizenships, residencies, tax planning, asset protection, banking, payment cards, payment processing, etc., reach out to us. You can book a call with me, clarity.fm/Michael Rosmer, or you can visit our websites, offshorecitizen.net, offshorecapitalist.com. Click the subscribe button, click the notification bell, click the like button, share this with your friends if you can, and I'm going to look forward to seeing you guys on the next video.